The clash between Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a heated exchange. It was the collision of two completely different perspectives on what power and accountability really mean. Pam Bondi, once Florida's Attorney General, had built her career on her image as a principled conservative who stood firm against corruption and misconduct. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had weathered storms, defended tough cases, and stood in rooms filled with power brokers. Her background in law had trained her to approach confrontation with strategy, to stay composed even when challenged. She knew how to hold her ground, and she wasn't used to being cornered. Across the table sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising Democratic voice known for her unapologetic candor and sharp intellect. She came from a background rooted in civil rights law, where she had often represented clients who didn't have money or influence. Crockett's energy was different from Bondi's, less polished perhaps, but grounded in lived experience. She didn't talk around issues. She went through them, point by point, like a lawyer cross-examining a witness. When the hearing began, the tone was polite. Both women greeted each other with professional courtesy. The committee chair opened the session, and for the first 20 minutes, everything unfolded as planned until Bondi, during her testimony, began emphasizing the importance of holding public officials accountable for their words and actions. She referenced recent controversies, suggesting that some members of Congress had failed to live up to the ethical standards their positions demanded. She didn't name anyone directly, but her tone was unmistakably pointed. Jasmine Crockett leaned slightly forward, pen in hand, listening. When Bondi finished, Crockett adjusted her microphone and began with a calm, even voice. She said she appreciated Bondi's remarks, but she wanted to clarify something. Accountability, she said, can't just be the weapon we use against our opponents. It's supposed to be the mirror we hold up to ourselves. Bondi smiled thinly, perhaps expecting a polite exchange. But Crockett wasn't done. She began referencing Bondi's own record, speaking with surgical precision. She mentioned specific cases Bondi had taken on as Attorney General, ones where her decisions were questioned for possible conflicts of interest. Crockett didn't raise her voice or use inflammatory language. She simply asked questions, the kind that don't require shouting to sting. When you talk about accountability, Ms. Bondi, she said, are you referring to the same accountability that applies when decisions appear politically motivated? Or is it something different when the scrutiny turns inward? The tone in the room shifted immediately. A few committee members glanced toward Bondi, unsure of how she'd respond. Cameras zoomed in. Bondi straightened her papers, took a breath, and replied that she had always acted within the law and in good faith. She framed her past decisions as matters of integrity and duty, but Crockett kept pressing gently, asking for specifics. What emerged wasn't a shouting match. It was a contrast of worldviews. Bondi represented the establishment figure, someone who believed in defending institutions, even when those institutions were flawed. She saw power as something that had to be maintained through discipline and image. Crockett, on the other hand, embodied the new political voice, one that viewed power as a responsibility, not a privilege. She challenged the assumption that experience automatically equals moral authority. What made the exchange powerful was that neither woman was entirely wrong. Bondi was right to say that public trust depends on accountability. Crockett was right to point out that accountability means nothing if it only runs one way. Their clash exposed a larger truth about American politics that both sides often see themselves as the guardians of principle, even when their definitions of principle are completely at odds. By the time the conversation ended, the room was still, the air thick with tension and quiet respect. No one had raised their voice. No one had stormed out. Yet everyone who watched could sense that something had shifted. Bondi's words carried the weight of tradition. Crockett's carried the momentum of change. Between them stood the very question the hearing was meant to explore. What does accountability really look like when both sides claim to own it? It wasn't about party lines anymore. It was about two women who saw the same word, justice, and defined it in ways shaped by their own journeys. Bondi's world had been one of courts' policy briefings and press conferences. Crockett's had been one of protests, community cases, and advocacy from the ground up. The hearing, in that moment, became less of a debate and more of a mirror reflecting the deep divide in how America sees power, who deserves it, how it's used, and who gets to question it. Jasmine Crockett's approach that day was the very definition of calm precision. From the moment she sat down across from Pam Bondi, it was clear she wasn't there to perform or grandstand. She had a strategy, not one built on outrage or theatrics, but on timing, facts, and focus. While others in the room seemed tense, shifting in their seats as the discussion got heavier, Crockett remained composed. She didn't raise her voice once. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she used silence, pauses, and careful phrasing as her most effective weapons. Pam Bondi, by contrast, came in with the confident posture of someone used to being the expert in the room. Her legal background gave her a natural sense of authority. She spoke with clarity, controlled her tone, and projected the image of calm power, at least at first. But Crockett had studied Bondi's communication style. She knew Bondi liked to dominate space with polished rhetoric, to lead discussions by establishing herself as the voice of reason. So Crockett didn't meet fire with fire. She did something more unexpected. She met control with control. When Bondi made her opening statements about the erosion of ethics in public office, Crockett simply nodded, jotting down notes, her expression unreadable. The cameras occasionally panned to her, but she gave no reaction, no visible cue for Bondi to read, and that was deliberate. When it was finally her turn to speak, Crockett didn't respond immediately to Bondi's points. Instead, she started with a short acknowledgement. "I respect your experience, Ms. Bondi." Her tone was neutral, polite, and even disarming. But what followed was a slow, methodical dismantling of Bondi's argument. She began by asking questions, direct, factual ones that seemed harmless at first, but carried a deeper undertone. "You mentioned the importance of consistency in applying ethical standards," Crockett said. "Would you agree that consistency also applies when evaluating one's own record in office?" Bondi smiled slightly and nodded, offering a polished response about fairness and integrity. Crockett listened, then followed up immediately with examples that showed cracks in that very claim. She cited moments during Bondi's tenure as Attorney General, when political donations had raised questions about conflicts of interest. Crockett didn't accuse her outright of wrongdoing. Instead, she asked, "Do you believe those situations reflected consistent ethical practice?" It wasn't an attack, it was a mirror, and that's what made it effective. As the exchange continued, Bondi's confidence began to waver, not because Crockett was louder or more forceful, but because she was precise. Every question was grounded in fact, every observation framed in respect. Bondi couldn't dismiss her as emotional or combative because Crockett refused to fit that mold. Her delivery was calm, almost surgical. She allowed pauses after each question, letting the silence do the work that outrage often can't. The longer the pauses stretched, the more Bondi's composure began to crack. Crockett didn't interrupt Bondi's responses. She waited patiently, then countered with a small, well-timed fact. It was a masterclass in control, the kind of quiet dominance that doesn't rely on volume. People in the audience could feel the shift. Bondi had walked in expecting a verbal duel, something she could frame as an ideological clash. But Crockett had turned it into a fact-based conversation that Bondi couldn't easily escape. When Bondi tried to pivot to general statements about principles and American values, Crockett gently brought her back to specifics. "Yes, I agree," she said, "but I'm asking about your own record. The moments when decisions were made that the public questioned. Isn't that part of the accountability you're talking about?" That question hung in the air like a weight. Bondi hesitated, realizing that any answer would draw more scrutiny. She looked visibly uncomfortable, not because she'd been shouted down, but because she'd been cornered by logic and calm persistence. By that point, even viewers watching from home could see the shift in tone. Bondi's body language changed. Her hand gestures became sharper, her smile more forced. Meanwhile, Crockett maintained the same steady rhythm, her voice calm, her eyes focused. She wasn't trying to embarrass Bondi. She was trying to hold her accountable in the very way Bondi had demanded others should be. In political debates, especially televised ones, calmness is often mistaken for weakness. But Crockett turned it into her greatest strength. Her poise made her arguments stronger because it made the facts impossible to dismiss as emotional reactions. Her questions carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were irrefutable. Even Bondi's allies in the room seemed unsure how to respond. Interrupting Crockett would have looked disrespectful. Engaging too deeply risked exposing more inconsistencies, so they stayed quiet, watching as Crockett, with nothing more than composure and preparation, slowly took command of the entire room. By the end of the exchange, it was clear that the dynamic had shifted. Pam Bondi, known for her sharp debate style, had been outmatched not by aggression but by precision. Crockett had shown that sometimes, the most devastating takedown doesn't come from shouting someone down, it comes from staying calm long enough to let the truth speak for itself. Pam Bondi's reaction during and after her exchange with Jasmine Crockett revealed something deeper than mere frustration. It exposed how power reacts when challenged in unexpected ways. Bondi had walked into that hearing confident, perhaps even certain that her years of public service and courtroom experience would give her an edge. She had faced aggressive prosecutors, skeptical reporters, and intense political opposition before, but she had always found a way to stay in control. What she hadn't anticipated was that someone like Jasmine Crockett, younger, less politically seasoned, and unapologetically direct, would confront her not with hostility, but with calm precision that left no room to deflect. At first, Bondi handled herself as she always had. She maintained her composed smile, adjusted her papers, and answered questions with polished professionalism. But as Crockett continued pressing her on inconsistencies in her record, something subtle began to shift. Bondi's tone tightened. Her responses became shorter, more defensive. The look in her eyes, usually steady and assertive, flickered with irritation. For someone who had built a reputation on control, losing it, even slightly, was something she didn't tolerate easily. Crockett's composure seemed to make things worse for her. Bondi was used to confrontations where her opponents got emotional or aggressive moments she could use to her advantage. But Crockett didn't give her that opening. Every question was deliberate, every pause intentional. It was as though Crockett had studied not just Bondi's record, but her temperament. She knew how to apply pressure without raising her voice, how to use calmness as a form of dominance. That quiet intensity made Bondi's defensive tone stand out even more. When Bondi tried to steer the conversation back to her original talking points about political ethics, Crockett interrupted only once, and only to clarify. "I understand your point," she said evenly, "but you keep referring to them, and they. I'm asking about you, your decisions, your record." That single sentence seemed to unsettle Bondi more than any accusation could have. It forced her to confront the fact that she was being held to the same standard she had just demanded of others. The tension in the room became palpable. Bondi began to gesture more as she spoke, her words picking up pace, as though she was trying to outrun the discomfort building beneath the surface. She talked about serving with integrity, about doing what she believed was right, but her sentences started looping, circling back to phrases she had already used. Crockett didn't interrupt. She just listened, her expression calm, her pen resting lightly in her hand. When Bondi finished, Crockett leaned slightly forward and said quietly, "I'm not questioning your belief in your duty, Ms. Banya. I'm questioning whether your version of accountability applies equally, even when it's inconvenient." The words hung there, soft but heavy. It wasn't a shout, it wasn't a personal attack, but it hit hard. The cameras caught the moment Bondi's jaw tightened, a rare flash of emotion breaking through her usually composed demeanor. After the hearing ended, reporters swarmed around both women. Crockett gave a few brief remarks, saying she respected Bondi's career, but believed public figures should welcome the same scrutiny they demand of others. Bondi, meanwhile, avoided most of the questions. When she finally stopped for a quick interview, her voice was firm but edged with frustration. She called the exchange a political ambush, suggesting Crockett had twisted her record for dramatic effect. Her composure was cracking, not completely, but just enough for viewers to notice. Later that evening, Bondi appeared on a conservative news program to discuss what had happened. She was visibly emotional, her tone sharper than usual. She described the hearing as disrespectful, accusing Crockett of using smear tactics rather than engaging in honest debate. But even as she defended herself, it was clear that something about the confrontation had gotten under her skin. For someone like Bondi, who had long prided herself on never losing control, the encounter felt like a reversal of roles. She had entered the room expecting to command respect, but instead found herself on the defensive. Crockett hadn't shouted her down or humiliated her. She had simply stood her ground and made Bondi's confidence work against her. Behind the scenes, staffers who attended the hearing later described Bondi as visibly upset after the session ended. One aide said she kept replaying parts of the exchange in her head, wondering how it had turned so quickly. It wasn't that Crockett had revealed any shocking new information. Everything she cited was already public, but the way she presented it, calmly and without malice, made it impossible for Bondi to brush off. What rattled her wasn't just being challenged, it was being challenged by someone she hadn't expected to be formidable. Bondi had underestimated Crockett, assuming that experience and stature would naturally grant her the upper hand. Instead, she was met with someone whose strength came from authenticity, not position, and that, more than anything, left her shaking. The exchange between Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett didn't just stay inside the walls of the hearing room. It exploded across social media within hours. What made it so captivating wasn't shouting, insults, or a dramatic walkout. It was the authenticity of the moment. Two women with opposing worldviews clashing in a way that felt unscripted, raw, and undeniably real. In a time when political arguments often feel rehearsed and predictable, this one cut through the noise because it wasn't about performance. It was about conviction. Clips from the hearing started circulating on X, YouTube, and TikTok almost immediately. Users didn't need to be political experts to sense the shift in tone that had taken place between them. Pam Bondi, polished and articulate, was visibly thrown off balance. Jasmine Crockett, and measured, held her composure in a way that felt unusual for modern politics. The moment when Crockett leaned forward and said, "I'm not questioning your belief in duty, I'm questioning whether your version of accountability applies equally," became the line replayed millions of times. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. Commentators across the spectrum began analyzing the exchange. Some conservative outlets defended Bondi, saying she had been unfairly targeted, while others quietly admitted that Crockett had handled herself with striking professionalism. On progressive channels, Crockett was praised for holding her ground without resorting to the theatrics often expected in political debates. Even those who disagreed with her politically acknowledged her poise. It was a rare moment when both sides found something worth noticing. The viral nature of the clip didn't come from conflict alone. It came from contrast. Bondi represented the establishment voice, experienced, confident, and trained in the rhythms of political messaging. Crockett represented the emerging generation of politicians who value transparency over polish, directness over diplomacy. When these two approaches collided, people saw more than a disagreement. They saw a generational and philosophical divide laid bare in real time. Bondi's reaction after the hearing only added fuel to the moment. Her televised interviews later that evening showed her visibly irritated, describing the incident as a staged attack and accusing Crockett of grandstanding. But the more she spoke, the more it seemed she was reacting to the unexpected power of Crockett's gum. Bondi wasn't used to losing control of the narrative, especially to someone she had likely viewed as inexperienced. That sense of loss, caught so clearly on camera, became part of the reason the exchange resonated so deeply with viewers. As the clip continued to trend, journalists began writing opinion pieces about what the confrontation represented. Some described it as a microcosm of American politics, a struggle between the old guard and a new voice that refuses to play by the same rules. Others saw it as a reminder that political strength doesn't always come from volume or seniority, but from authenticity. Crockett had managed to turn restraint into power, something rare in a time when outrage often dominates headlines. Bondi's supporters, meanwhile, defended her fiercely. They argued that she had been ambushed, that her record was being unfairly portrayed, and that the viral attention had twisted the context of the discussion. But even in defending her, many couldn't ignore that the moment had changed public perception. The clip didn't just capture a disagreement, it captured a shift in power dynamics, one where experience alone was no longer enough to command authority. In the following days, late-night shows picked up the exchange, playing snippets with commentary about how politics might be evolving. Social media users began posting side-by-side edits comparing Bondi's confident opening remarks with her visibly frustrated reactions later in the hearing. It wasn't meant to mock her, but rather to highlight the subtle unraveling that occurred when composure met calm persistence. Even within political circles, the exchange sparked quiet conversations. Staffers and strategists discussed how tone and emotional control had become as important as facts in shaping public opinion. Crockett's restraint was being studied not just as a debating technique, but as a communication model, one that showed how silence, timing, and authenticity could overpower even the most experienced speaker. For Pam Bondi. The viral fallout was uncomfortable, but instructive. She remained steadfast in her beliefs, but the incident forced her to confront how the public now perceived her. Her critics saw a moment of weakness. Her supporters saw her as unfairly treated. But everyone, regardless of side, agreed on one thing. The exchange revealed something honest about modern politics. It wasn't just about ideology or party lines. It was about who could stay true to themselves under pressure, and who could adapt when the spotlight turned unexpectedly harsh. That's why the moment refused to fade from the news cycle. It wasn't just a viral clip, it was a snapshot of truth, captured in real time, showing that authenticity can sometimes be louder than anger, and that composure, when held firm, can become the most powerful voice in the room. In the days that followed, both Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett became the focus of national attention, not because of political scandal or sensational headlines, but because of what their exchange represented. It wasn't just a clash between two public figures. It was a reflection of where the country stands, torn between tradition and transformation, between the practiced Polish of the old establishment and the unfiltered conviction of a new generation. Pam Bondi had built a career on being unshakable. Her courtroom confidence and political poise had made her a familiar face in conservative circles. She was the embodiment of control, precise, persuasive, and always prepared. But even someone as seasoned as Bondi couldn't have predicted how deeply a calm, factual challenge could unsettle her image. It wasn't that she had been caught off guard by information she had faced scrutiny before. It was that the challenge came in a form she couldn't easily deflect. Jasmine Crockett hadn't attacked her character, she had questioned her consistency. And in politics, that's often far more difficult to defend. For Crockett, the moment was defining. She hadn't set out to create a viral sensation or to dominate headlines. She had simply done what she often preached. Speak with truth, not volume. Her quiet persistence and refusal to be intimidated reminded many people why authenticity matters. Viewers across the spectrum, even those who didn't align with her politics, recognized something genuine in her composure. She didn't just debate, she listened, waited, and then spoke in a way that made every word count. In the broader sense. Their exchange became more than just a story about two women in politics. It became a lesson in how the landscape of communication is changing. The old rules where experience and authority automatically commanded respect no longer apply in the same way. Now, credibility is earned in real time, on camera, in front of millions who can replay every second. And in that kind of environment, authenticity almost always outweighs reputation. Pam. Bondi's frustration in the aftermath wasn't just about the moment itself. It was about what it symbolized. She was a figure from an era when public image could be carefully managed through press releases and interviews. But Jasmine Crockett's approach, grounded, transparent, and unfiltered, showed that the new arena of politics rewards sincerity over script. The exchange didn't destroy Bondi's standing, but it did remind her, and everyone watching, that power now operates differently. Asterisk for the viewers. The viral hearing was oddly refreshing. It wasn't filled with shouting, insults, or chaos. It was simply two people facing off over ideals they both believed in, each unwilling to back down. In an age where debates often feel hollow or rehearsed, this moment felt startlingly real. It didn't change the world overnight, but it made people pay attention not to the noise of politics, but to its rare moments of truth, asterisk, and perhaps that's why the story stayed alive longer than anyone expected. It wasn't about who won or lost the argument. It was about what the moment revealed. That control doesn't always mean strength. That calmness can be its own form of power, and that sometimes the most unforgettable confrontations aren't the loudest ones. They're the ones where silence, honesty, and conviction